Okay, I'm going to do several examples of the beginning of factoring in this video. So let's talk about a couple of examples of what factoring really is. I'm going to first talk about actually multiplying. So if a question asked you to multiply, let's say I had negative 2x plus 4. Alright, what we've been talking about, this we can simplify, we can distribute, a lot of different ways of writing that, a lot of different ways of saying that. But at the end of the day, we know we can multiply this out. We would end up with negative 2x minus 8. Okay. That's what multiply is. So what we are going to talk about then is doing the opposite. Okay. So we are going to talk about undoing the multiply. I'm going to call this the opposite, which is really called factoring. So if I were to now ask you to factor, and then here the question would say negative 2x minus 8. What we want to do is exactly that. We want to undo the multiplying. It's the opposite. So what is it that is in common? You're thinking about a greatest common factor. Now let me write that up here. So remember, this is called the greatest common factor. Okay, the GCF. Let's think about what is it that is in common. We notice right away there is definitely going to be the number 2 in common. Certainly 2 goes into 2 and 2 goes into 8. So if I were to take out the 2, what would I be left over with? I would be left over with the negative x and a negative 4. Okay. Let's think about what we talked about. First of all, we talked about multiplying. Now when I talked about doing the opposite, the factoring, what we did was divide. Again, I took this 2, divided it by 2, took this 8, divided it by 2. When I took the 8 and divided it by 2, that was where the 4 came from. Okay. Alright, now of course that's not quite the same. We could have also taken out instead a negative 2. If you factor out a negative 2, going back to look at what we have in the question, we certainly have, after I take out the negative 2, there's going to be the x left over. And then after I take out the negative 2, the negative 2 from the negative 8, again, you're dividing. You're thinking of it as negative 8 divided by negative 2, which gives us the positive 4. So that is the idea of factoring. Let's do another one, see if we can get ourselves on the same page here. What if I were to ask you then to factor, let's say, 4x squared minus 12x. Okay, here let's go again and think about what this greatest common factor is. Numerically, it's a little bit easier. Okay, if you start at just the numbers and deal with the variables later, sometimes that's a little bit easier. So let me talk about the GCF over here on the side. Certainly we're thinking about what number is going to go into both 4 and 12. And we can tell that 4 is going to go into both of those. Okay, and then you're going to talk about the variable. I have x squared for the first term and x for the second term. So what is in common? What goes into both of those terms? And that's definitely the x. Okay, so again, when we're talking about factoring, going to take out the greatest common factor, so that was the 4 and the x. We're going to see what's left over. We're going to do that division. Okay. So I took out the 4 and I took out one of the x's for the first term, so I'm left over with x. And then I have a negative 12x. Again, I've divided by 4x. That will give me a negative 3. I've taken out the x, so that's no longer going to be there. So this is what I think my answer is. I'm going to kind of even box this. But how do we check? How do I know for sure? Okay, I can try to do this all day, but how do we check that it actually makes sense? So in order to check this, what you do is you multiply, and you try to see if you get the original question. So I'm going to take that 4x, x minus 3. Okay, I'm going to check my work by multiplying my answer out to see if I get my question. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll distribute this out. 4x times x gives me 4x squared. And then 4x times negative 3 gives me negative 12x. Oops, sorry about that. Negative 12x, which is, of course, the original question. So I did do it right. So my answer, my final answer is 4x times x minus 3. So that's the idea of factoring out the greatest common factor. Of course, we can talk about this in more detail. We can make this more complicated, throw in more variables, more constants. But this is the beginning of factoring. Talks about undoing a multiplication. All right, you're writing something as a product of its factors.